Welcome to the Korean Man and Black Woman Tales. The Korean Man and Black Woman Tales channel will bring you stories of strong bonds, cultural differences, passionate love, and unforgettable dramatic events. If you love interracial love stories and cinematic storytelling, then this is the place for you. Enjoy listening. Please subscribe to the channel to hear more great stories. I walk into the penthouse expecting a negotiation with a criminal organization. Instead, I find myself staring at the man who has controlled half the city's underground economy for over a decade. Kim Jae-hyun sits behind a wall of glass overlooking Los Angeles, calm and perfectly composed, like a king watching his kingdom. When I tell him I am the lawyer building the case that will dismantle his empire, he does not threaten me. He does not deny anything. He simply laughs. Not loudly, not angrily, just a quiet, amused laugh that echoes through the room as if I have told the most entertaining joke he has heard all week. In that moment I realize something dangerous. This man does not fear the law. He does not even respect it. He thinks the system exists far beneath him. My name is Maya Carter, and for 5 years I have been chasing ghosts inside the financial arteries of this city. I am a federal attorney specializing in organized financial crime, the kind of work that requires patience, obsession, and a willingness to spend years pulling threads that may lead nowhere. Most prosecutors chase criminals with guns and drugs. I chase money. Money leaves trails. Money exposes secrets. And money, if you follow it long enough, always leads to someone who believes they are untouchable. In this case, every account, every shipping ledger, every suspicious corporate transfer led back to one man, Kim Jae-hyun. On paper, he is a billionaire businessman who owns shipping firms, logistics companies, real estate developments, and technology investments. In reality, he is the invisible architect behind a network of shell corporations laundering millions through the port of Los Angeles. For years, prosecutors tried to touch him and failed. Witnesses vanished. Documents disappeared. Companies dissolved overnight and reappeared under new names before anyone could react. Every investigation collapsed before it reached the courtroom. Eventually, the system learned to live with him. Untouchable men often become invisible problems. But I never stopped looking. Piece by piece, company by company, I rebuilt the financial map of his empire until the pattern became undeniable. When I finally received authorization to confront him directly, most people in my department believed it was a symbolic gesture, a warning meant to scare him. They expected me to negotiate, to push for cooperation, maybe to convince him to sacrifice a few expendable associates. They expected diplomacy. They expected caution. Instead, I walked into his penthouse, placed the investigation file on the table, and calmly told him that his empire was already collapsing. Kim studied me carefully, his dark eyes sharp with curiosity rather than anger. The silence stretched long enough for the city lights to flicker across the glass behind him. Then he leaned back in his chair and asked one quiet question. Are you brave, Miss Carter, or simply reckless? I met his gaze without hesitation and answered with the only truth that mattered. Neither. I am the lawyer who is about to dismantle everything you built. His smile returned slowly, like a storm gathering behind calm water. As I turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice softer but far more serious than before. You are dangerous. The elevator doors closed between us before he finished his next sentence, but the words followed me down 30 floors like a promise. And I find that very interesting. The war began quietly, the way the most dangerous wars always do. No gunfire. No headlines at first. Just paperwork, subpoenas, and financial filings moving through federal systems like silent knives. Within 48 hours of that meeting in Kim Jae-hyun's penthouse, my team executed the first phase of the investigation. Federal auditors issued simultaneous reviews on 4 companies tied to Kim's logistics network. On paper, they were legitimate shipping corporations moving electronics, construction materials, and luxury imports through the port of Los Angeles. But buried inside their ledgers were patterns that only someone obsessed with financial crime would notice. Identical invoice structures across unrelated companies. Payment chains routed through 3 countries before returning to the same holding accounts. Shipping volumes that did not match warehouse capacity. To ordinary regulators, it looked like complicated global business. To me, it looked like laundering. And once the legal machinery started turning, it moved faster than even Kim expected. The first real crack appeared 3 days later. My analysts uncovered a shell corporation registered in Singapore that quietly controlled a network of investment accounts connected to Kim's shipping businesses. The structure was elegant, almost beautiful in its complexity. Profits from dozens of small transactions were funneled through the Singapore account before being redistributed through investment funds and real estate purchases. To an untrained eye, it appeared like a standard international holding strategy. But hidden in the transfer records were irregular spikes in deposits that could not be explained by legal trade. Those spikes matched the timelines of several unresolved smuggling investigations at the port. It was enough. By Thursday morning, the Department of Justice authorized an emergency asset freeze. $80 million vanished from Kim's operational accounts in a single afternoon. When the order went public, financial media erupted. Investors began calling Kim's companies for explanations. Some partners immediately withdrew contracts. The empire did not collapse, not yet, but the first visible fracture had appeared. I expected retaliation. Men like Kim did not tolerate public humiliation. I expected intimidation attempts, political pressure, maybe even threats against my team. Instead, something far stranger happened. Kim did nothing. According to our surveillance reports, he spent most of the week inside his main office tower, reviewing legal filings and financial reports with unusual patience. His advisors argued for aggressive countermeasures, but Kim refused them all. One source inside his organization later described the atmosphere as unsettling. Kim was not angry. He was studying the attack like a mathematician examining a difficult equation. He ordered copies of every legal motion we filed. He requested detailed profiles on every prosecutor assigned to the case. And at some point during that research, he became particularly interested in one name. Mine. The second strike landed the following Monday. My team uncovered a second network of companies connected through an electronics import chain that moved cargo through warehouses outside Long Beach. The businesses looked legitimate, but their profit margins were statistically impossible. Once we cross-referenced customs declarations with financial transfers, the pattern became undeniable. By midweek, federal agents shut down 2 warehouses and seized several shipping containers for investigation. Another $30 million in assets became temporarily inaccessible. The news spread faster this time. Analysts on financial television began openly questioning Kim Jae-hyun's corporate structure. Investors who had once admired his discipline started asking nervous questions about regulatory exposure. In less than 10 days, the illusion of perfect legitimacy surrounding his empire began to weaken. The night after the warehouse seizures, I returned to my office long after most of the building had emptied. The city outside the windows looked peaceful, but my mind was still racing through financial charts and legal strategies. I pushed open the door expecting silence and paperwork. Instead, I found Kim sitting in the chair across from my desk as if he had been there for hours. My security team had not reported anyone entering the building. The calm way he sat there, perfectly relaxed in the dim light of the office, sent a cold wave through my spine. A half-finished glass of whiskey rested on the table beside him. He gestured casually toward the bottle like a host greeting a guest. "You work very late, Ms. Carter." I did not reach for the phone or call security. Fear would have given him satisfaction. Instead, I walked into the room and placed my files on the desk like nothing unusual had happened. "You are trespassing," I said evenly. Kim tilted his head slightly, studying me with quiet interest. Up close, he looked exactly the same as during our first meeting. Controlled. Alert. Almost amused. "Trespassing implies ownership," he replied. "But tonight I am simply visiting the person who declared war on my businesses." I remained standing, unwilling to give him the comfort of casual conversation. "Your businesses are under federal investigation." He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging an interesting academic argument. "Yes, and you are very good at what you do. Freezing $80 million in under a week is impressive." The compliment hung in the air between us like a test. I ignored it. "If you came here to threaten me, you are wasting your time." Kim smiled faintly and took another slow sip of whiskey. "Threats are inefficient. They create unpredictable reactions. I prefer observation." He leaned forward slightly, his expression sharpening with curiosity. "Tell me something honestly, Ms. Carter. Did you believe I would panic after the first strike?" I met his gaze without hesitation. "No, I believed you would make mistakes." For the first time, his smile faded into something more thoughtful. The silence stretched several seconds before he stood and adjusted his jacket. "You are the first person who has tried to dismantle my empire with patience instead of fear," he said quietly. Then he paused beside the door and looked back at me with a strange mixture of respect and challenge. "And that makes this far more interesting than I expected." Pressure arrived slowly at first, like distant thunder before a storm. The moment federal investigators began freezing accounts and seizing cargo connected to Kim's network, the silence inside my department disappeared. Phones started ringing in offices that normally ignored financial crime units. Lobbyists began requesting briefings. Political staffers suddenly wanted updates about sensitive international business relationships. Within 2 weeks, the case that had once been considered a quiet financial investigation turned into a public confrontation between one prosecutor and one of the most powerful businessmen on the West Coast. The headlines were cautious at first, but they carried the same underlying message. Someone had finally decided to challenge Kim Jae-hyun. Inside the Department of Justice, the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to concern. Investigations against billionaires had a habit of becoming political disasters when the evidence was not strong enough. Every mistake would belong to me. Kim responded with the kind of strategy that revealed why no one had managed to defeat him before. Instead of violence or intimidation, he attacked the case itself. Witnesses who had quietly agreed to testify suddenly became impossible to locate. A shipping manager scheduled to provide financial records vanished from his apartment 2 days before his interview with federal agents. Another witness withdrew his cooperation after receiving calls from corporate lawyers representing one of Kim's holding companies. At the same time, Kim's legal team flooded the courts with procedural challenges designed to slow every part of the investigation. Subpoenas were disputed. Warrants were contested. Entire lines of financial evidence became tangled in months of legal argument. Each delay cost the government time, and time was the one resource prosecutors could never recover. Every morning I walked into the office, knowing that the empire I was trying to dismantle was rebuilding its defenses faster than we could tear them down. My own department began to feel the pressure as well. Daniel Ross, the senior federal prosecutor assigned to supervise the case, called me into his office one afternoon with a stack of legal motions spread across his desk like a warning. Daniel was a careful man, the type of attorney who survived in government by never taking risks that could not be controlled. He tapped one of the motions with the end of his pen and sighed quietly. "You realize what happens if we lose this case," he said. I understood immediately. Prosecutors who challenged billionaires and failed rarely received a second chance. A collapse in court would not simply damage the investigation. It would destroy the credibility of everyone involved. I nodded slowly. "We will not lose," I answered. Daniel studied me for several seconds, as if measuring whether confidence or stubbornness was speaking. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Then you had better find the piece of evidence that proves everything," he said quietly. Because Kim Jae-hyun is not the kind of man who makes mistakes twice. A week later, Kim Jae-hyun invited me to dinner. The invitation arrived through an attorney representing one of his companies, delivered with the same formal politeness used for business negotiations between corporations. Daniel Ross almost laughed when he read it. "He wants to understand you," he said. "Men like him do not meet their enemies unless they believe they can influence them." He expected me to refuse. Instead, I accepted immediately. Prosecutors were trained to avoid contact with suspects outside controlled legal environments, but this case had never followed normal rules. Kim was not afraid of the law. That meant the only way to defeat him was to understand the mind behind the empire. The restaurant he chose sat high above the harbor, where the lights of cargo ships moved slowly across the dark water like floating cities. Kim Jae-hyun arrived exactly on time, dressed in a simple black suit that looked almost modest compared to the wealth surrounding him. For a few seconds, we stood across from each other in silence while the host prepared our table. Then Kim smiled slightly, the same calm expression he carried in his penthouse office. "I was curious if you would come," he said. I took my seat without returning the smile. "I am curious about many things," I replied, "including why a man under federal investigation would invite the prosecutor responsible for dismantling his companies to dinner." Kim poured wine into 2 glasses before answering. "Because wars are more interesting when you understand the person fighting you." The conversation that followed was unlike any negotiation I had experienced in courtrooms or boardrooms. Kim did not try to deny the investigation or intimidate me with his resources. Instead, he spoke about his past with a calm honesty that made the story sound almost unreal. He described growing up in a cramped apartment above a grocery store run by relatives who barely had enough money to survive. He described joining street gangs as a teenager because crime paid faster than legal work. The empire he built, he explained, was never created through sudden violence, but through patience and discipline. One business at a time. One partnership at a time. Eventually, the illegal operations became hidden inside legitimate corporations so successfully that even regulators believed the illusion. People like to believe the world is divided between criminals and respectable businessmen, he said quietly. In reality, the difference is often just paperwork. For the first time since the investigation began, I saw the complexity behind the man I was trying to destroy. Kim Jae-hyun was ruthless. That much was undeniable. But he was also brilliant in ways that made his success almost inevitable. Thousands of employees depended on the legal companies he now controlled. Entire shipping routes moved through his logistics network. Destroying his empire would not simply punish a criminal organization. It would collapse businesses that supported thousands of families. The thought disturbed me more than I expected. Kim Jae-hyun watched my expression carefully, as if he could see the calculation unfolding behind my eyes. You are wondering if dismantling everything I built will cause more damage than you intend, he said calmly. I met his gaze without flinching. I am wondering how long you believed the law would ignore you. The dinner ended without threats or agreements. When we walked toward the exit, Kim Jae-hyun paused beside the glass wall overlooking the harbor. Cargo ships moved slowly across the water, their lights reflecting in long lines across the surface. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Kim turned toward me with an expression that was strangely thoughtful. If we had met in another life, he said quietly, we would have been allies. I shook my head slowly. In another life, I replied, you would not be running a criminal empire. Kim Jae-hyun smiled faintly, the same calm expression that had unsettled me since our first meeting. Or perhaps, he said, you would have built one with me. The trial began on a gray Monday morning that felt heavier than any courtroom I had ever entered. Reporters filled the gallery before the judge even arrived, their cameras and notebooks ready for what had already become the most talked-about corruption case in the city. Outside the courthouse, protesters argued with each other across the barricades, some demanding justice against organized crime, others defending the businessman who had created thousands of jobs across the region. I sat at the prosecution table reviewing the final stack of documents while the low murmur of voices filled the room like distant waves. Across the aisle, Kim Jae-hyun entered with his legal team, moving with the same quiet composure he carried everywhere. The courtroom noise dimmed slightly when people recognized him. To most observers, he still looked like a disciplined corporate executive rather than the architect of a criminal network. He glanced toward me briefly before sitting down, his expression calm enough to suggest that this trial was simply another negotiation. The opening arguments began with the weight of months of investigation pressing behind every word. I stood and walked toward the center of the courtroom, feeling dozens of eyes following each step. The evidence presented itself like a map of a hidden world. Shell corporations linked through offshore accounts, shipping manifests that concealed millions of dollars in unexplained transfers, corporate records that connected seemingly unrelated businesses to the same secret holding structure. Piece by piece, I described the system Kim had built, a financial labyrinth designed to move illegal money through legitimate trade until the origin disappeared completely. The jury listened in silence while financial charts appeared on the courtroom screens behind me. It was not a dramatic story of violence or gang warfare. It was something colder and more deliberate, a system designed by someone patient enough to hide crimes inside ordinary business transactions. When I finished speaking, the room remained silent for a moment before the judge signaled for the defense. Kim Jae-hyun's attorneys responded with a strategy that revealed once again how carefully his empire had been designed. They did not deny the complexity of the corporate network. Instead, they argued that international business often required complicated financial structures. They suggested that prosecutors were misinterpreting normal trade operations because they did not understand the scale of global commerce. Each accusation I presented was reframed as an assumption rather than proof. By the end of the defense argument, the same evidence I had used to describe a criminal system now appeared, at least on the surface, like aggressive but legal international investment. The battle inside the courtroom became a contest of interpretation. Numbers alone did not convict anyone. Intent had to be proven beyond doubt, and Kim's lawyers understood exactly how to blur that line. Days passed as witnesses testified and financial analysts explained transaction records to the jury. Some moments felt like progress, especially when former employees described unusual payment instructions or hidden accounts connected to Kim Jae-hyun's companies. Other moments felt like setbacks when the defense carefully dismantled witness credibility or introduced alternative explanations for suspicious transfers. Throughout the entire process, Kim Jae-hyun remained silent at the defense table, observing the courtroom with the same thoughtful attention he had shown during our earlier meetings. It was impossible to read his expression. At times he seemed almost curious about how the legal machinery surrounding him worked. That calm presence unsettled many people in the courtroom. Defendants usually displayed fear or anger when facing possible prison sentences. Kim behaved like someone studying a complicated negotiation rather than a criminal on trial. The turning point arrived during the third week of testimony when the defense unexpectedly requested permission for Kim Jae-hyun himself to address the court. The request surprised nearly everyone. Defendants rarely spoke directly because every word carried legal risk. When the judge granted permission, the courtroom quieted immediately. Kim stood slowly, adjusting his jacket before walking toward the witness stand with measured steps. For the first time since the trial began, the attention of the entire room focused entirely on him. Kim Jae-hyun began speaking calmly, his voice clear enough that even the reporters in the back row leaned forward to listen. Instead of denying the investigation, he acknowledged that some financial operations connected to his companies had violated regulations. The admission sent a ripple of whispers through the courtroom. Partial confession was the last thing anyone expected. But Kim did not stop there. He explained that the financial system described by prosecutors had not been built only to conceal illegal profits. It had also exposed corruption among public officials who secretly accepted payments from corporations seeking favorable contracts and regulatory protection. As he spoke, his attorneys submitted documents showing financial transfers connected to several influential figures in city government. The courtroom erupted in sudden noise as reporters scrambled to record the names appearing on the screens behind him. Some of those officials had publicly supported the prosecution earlier in the investigation. Now their own financial records appeared tangled inside the same network they had condemned. The judge called repeatedly for silence while the legal teams argued over the relevance of the new evidence. The trial had suddenly expanded beyond a single criminal case into a broader scandal that threatened powerful institutions. I stood slowly when the judge asked for the prosecution's response. The situation unfolding in front of us could easily destroy the entire case if the defense succeeded in redirecting attention toward political corruption instead of Kim Jae-hyun's crimes. For several seconds, I looked across the courtroom at the man who had engineered this moment. Kim met my gaze calmly, almost encouragingly, as if he were challenging me to adapt. I understood the message instantly. This was his final strategy. If the investigation collapsed under the weight of scandal, he would walk away from the courtroom with his empire largely intact. I stepped toward the center of the room again, ignoring the noise behind me, and addressed the judge with the same clarity I had used on the first day of trial. The evidence presented by the defense does not invalidate the financial crimes already documented in this court, I said evenly. If anything, it confirms that the system built by the defendant was designed to manipulate institutions at every level, including those responsible for oversight. I then requested authorization to expand the investigation to include every official whose name appeared in the newly revealed documents. The courtroom fell silent again as the judge considered the request. After several tense moments, he nodded slowly and approved the motion. The decision changed the atmosphere instantly. What had begun as a trial against one criminal empire had now become a larger investigation into corruption across both corporate and political structures. Kim Jae-hyun watched the exchange carefully, a faint expression of respect appearing on his face when he realized I had turned his strategy against him. The war between us had reached its final stage, and neither of us intended to retreat. The verdict arrived on a cold afternoon that felt strangely quiet compared to the chaos that had surrounded the trial for weeks. By the time the jury returned to the courtroom, the investigation had already reshaped the political landscape of the city. Several officials exposed during Kim Jae-hyun's testimony had resigned or quietly disappeared from public view. Corporate executives connected to the bribery network were facing their own investigations. What began as a single financial crime case had widened into a full-scale corruption scandal that no one could ignore anymore. When the judge entered the courtroom that day, the atmosphere felt heavier than it had at any moment during the trial. Everyone understood that the ruling would not simply decide the fate of one man. It would determine how much of the system surrounding him would survive. Kim Jae-hyun stood beside his attorneys when the verdict was read, his posture calm and controlled as always. The jury confirmed what months of evidence had demonstrated. The hidden financial network controlling his empire had violated federal law through systematic laundering operations disguised inside legitimate trade. Several shell corporations tied directly to Kim's authority were ordered dissolved immediately. Assets connected to those operations would be seized and redirected through federal restitution programs. Yet the ruling did not end with the total destruction many observers expected. Because Kim Jae-hyun had cooperated during the final phase of the investigation and provided evidence exposing wider corruption, the court reduced the potential sentence dramatically. Instead of life imprisonment, he faced a limited term under strict financial supervision. The criminal infrastructure behind his empire would disappear, but the legitimate businesses employing thousands of workers would remain intact under new regulatory oversight. The courtroom erupted into noise the moment the ruling concluded. Reporters rushed toward the exits to deliver breaking news, while legal teams gathered documents and whispered urgently to their clients. I remained seated for a moment, watching the scene unfold with a strange sense of distance. After 5 years of investigation and months of legal warfare, the empire I had pursued so relentlessly had finally collapsed in front of me. Yet the victory felt more complicated than I had imagined. Kim Jae-hyun turned toward me across the courtroom before leaving with his attorneys. For a brief second, the noise around us seemed to fade. He did not smile this time. Instead, he gave a slow nod that felt less like defeat and more like acknowledgement between two opponents who had reached the end of a difficult battle. Months later, I met him again in a quiet cafe far from the courthouse and the cameras that once followed every development of the case. Kim Jae-hyun arrived alone, without bodyguards or legal advisors, looking more like an ordinary businessman than the architect of the network that had once controlled half the city's underground economy. We sat across from each other in silence for a moment before he spoke. "You dismantled everything I built," he said calmly. I stirred my coffee and looked at him carefully before answering. "Not everything." Kim Jae-hyun understood immediately. The criminal empire had vanished, but the legitimate companies that survived were now operating under the strictest legal oversight in the country. Thousands of employees who once worked unknowingly inside a laundering system now had stable jobs inside businesses that no longer hid illegal money. Kim nodded slowly, accepting the truth of it. As we finished our conversation, he leaned back in his chair and studied me with the same curious expression he had shown during our first meeting in his penthouse office. "You know," he said quietly, "most people who tried to destroy me were motivated by fear or ambition. You were motivated by something else." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "The law," I replied. Kim Jae-hyun shook his head with a faint smile. "No," he said, "by conviction." When we left the cafe, that evening the city lights were beginning to appear across the skyline. As I walked toward my car, one thought remained in my mind longer than I expected. I had spent years trying to destroy Kim Jae-hyun's empire. In the end, what actually happened was far more complicated. I had forced him to change the only way a man like him ever could. And somehow, during the long war between us, he had changed me too. In the end, the war between us did not end with destruction, but with transformation. Kim Jae-hyun lost the empire built on shadows, yet the businesses that remained now stood in the light of the law. I won the case that defined my career, but I also learned that justice is rarely as simple as victory or defeat. Sometimes the real victory is forcing the truth into the open and changing the course of a system that believed it could never be challenged. And sometimes the people we fight the hardest become the ones who reveal who we truly are. Now I want to hear from you. If you were in my position, would you have destroyed Kim's empire completely, or would you have done exactly what I did? If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us bring more powerful drama stories like this to life.